So, good evening, sir, and I welcome you to the Expert Speak of AIDA. AIDA is a Kathmandu-based think tank which work on foreign policy and international relations. I am Alakh Ranjan, working as Junior Fellow at AIDA. I'm also a research assistant at Center for Land Warfare Studies, which is a New Delhi-based think tank. So today we'll be talking about the soft power diplomacy. How will it be changed in the post-COVID world order, especially Indian and Chinese in the South Asia, in the South Asian context. And as you have written so much about South Asia and soft power diplomacy, I've been reading your paper and also your book, The Reinvention of Indian Foreign Policy, which you have read. It's a very fine book. I just completed its book review also, sir. Will be published, so I will share it soon. So thank you very much, sir, for giving the time. So starting with the interview, I would like to ask, sir, what according to you is soft power? How do you define it?
So I define it very much as Joseph Nye defined it originally, which is to say that soft power is the power of attraction. So it isn't like other kinds of power, which is coercive or which involves relationships of dependence, which might involve threats and promises, rewards, and so on. Instead, what soft power involves is that attractive power that societies have, which governments might be able to use, but societies have, cultures have, groups of people have. And that involves a whole range of different things, whether it's cultural traditions or art, it might be literature, philosophy, it might be music, it might be architecture, a whole number of things like that. It might be movies, it might be, in the case of the South Koreans, it might be pop music. There's a whole number of different aspects to that, which can make up a country's soft power.
So, sir, talking about Indian and Chinese soft power, like how much has Indian and Chinese soft power changed under PM Modi and Xi Jinping? And adding to it, how much do you think that personality or the personal cult drive or impact the soft power of a country?
So there's lots going on in a question like that. I mean, obviously, in the case of India and China, these are inheritors to incredible civilizational riches. All of those things that I've talked about before, so art or music and so on and so forth. What the Modi government has done since 2014 is to try to put some more of those things front and center in Indian diplomacy. So it's tried to make more use of the civilizational, philosophical, religious connections between India and other countries in the region, depending on which countries they're talking about. So it might be Buddhism in some cases. In the case of Nepal, it's been Hinduism. So it's tried to put these ideas and these traditions and so on more front and center than it has done in the past. In the case of the Chinese, it's a little bit more complicated, I think, because on the one hand, China is manifestly, clearly the inheritor of this great civilizational wealth. But on the other hand, the Chinese Communist Party, at certain periods of its history, particularly during the Cultural Revolution, has turned against elements of that civilizational inheritance, and in some cases just physically destroyed them. And of course, Xi Jinping is actually a product of the Cultural Revolution. So now, when it comes to how these two governments have behaved then over the last few years or so, both of them have tried, as I've said, to use some elements of this civilizational inheritance that they've got to try to persuade some regional countries that these two countries are more benign, that there are stronger people-to-people connections, strong cultural relations, and so on. But whether or not both countries, both leaders have managed to use these resources well and managed to improve the reputation of their countries in the respective regions is a bit more questionable, actually. And we might want to talk about that a little bit more. But I would say, actually, the reputation of both countries has been hit by a number of other factors, and by some of the things, some of the foreign policy things, some of the security things, policy that has been enacted by both Modi and Xi Jinping since, 2013 in Xi Jinping's case.
So, sir, talking about their personality, do you see that more similarity than differences in their personality when they're employing soft power in this region, South Asia?
Mm. Look, in both cases, these are two leaders who see themselves and portray themselves as strongmen. They both, to varying degrees, also see themselves as representations of particular cultural traditions. More, Prime Minister Modi, more, I think, than Chairman or President Xi Jinping. Modi himself, of course, has been at the forefront of trying to market yoga to a much bigger audience, for example, and he's known to practice yoga. He's also been an advocate of vegetarianism and a more environmentally attuned way of living. Xi Jinping is a little bit different, I think. Clearly, he's wanted to try and elevate himself as a kind of a Confucian ruler of sorts, but also drawing upon the communist tradition as well. So they both want to portray themselves as being, as I say, strong advocates for their culture, for civilization that they represent. Now, again, how that's been received, it kind of differs from country to country.
So, sir, talking about Chinese soft power, and especially the combination of hard power and soft power, which has been termed as smart power by Joseph Nye. The American combination has been termed by him as smart power, and the Chinese has been termed as sharp power. So, do you think that China, this sharp power which Joseph Nye has termed, is it really what China has been employing in South Asia? Is it the smart power or the sharp power which China has employed in South Asia?
So I think that the Chinese have clearly been trying to expand their influence in South Asia. In some cases, they've also interfered, I think, in some of the internal politics. Now, of course, India also has a long tradition of trying to influence elites and publics in South Asia, and in some cases, like in Nepal, for example, it has interfered quite extensively in local politics there. So both countries have done this in the past. Now, I think the question of whether it's smart or sharp, I think the smartness is meant to be around trying to use as much of your soft power as you can to gain influence. When it's sharp, that involves some other things that are perhaps less benign, less friendly, and that might involve interference. That might involve just outright bribery of politicians, or it might involve trying to influence them in other ways, trying to involve them in property deals or in a whole range of other things like that. Or it might mean kind of ideological influence as well. So, and there I think there is evidence of that sharp power being used. And then of course the other aspect of all of this is influence over social media platforms. We've seen recently, I think, 170,000 accounts linked to Russia and China being taken down from Twitter, Facebook, and other social media platforms. And we have seen alleged attempts by both of those countries to try to use social media to influence politics in some of those some neighboring countries. It varies very much in South Asia as far as what I can see what China tries to do. So in Pakistan, Nepal, I think it's been more intense. I think in other places in South Asia, it's been less so.
Yeah, so talking about soft power, public diplomacy is a very important tool of soft power diplomacy. And if we compare the soft power diplomacy of China and India, China has employed a very coherent and very strategic, like a very streamlined public diplomacy vis-a-vis South Asia is concerned, through elite to elite, scholarship and everything. And when we come to India's soft power diplomacy, as I was reading your paper, India's new soft power diplomacy, in which you have mentioned that in this region, the soft power diplomacy is more about giving aid and scholarship and nothing more than that. So do you think that in this region, if we talk about soft power diplomacy, India's soft power diplomacy has been weaker if we see in the present century, in past 20 years, if we compare that to China? What do you think?
So there's a big difference in the amount of money that China is able to spend compared to India. and the amount of resources that China has put into its charm offensive has been much, much greater. So when a colleague and I tried to estimate this a while ago now in 2013, some of the numbers that were going around were about 9 to 10 billion US dollars being spent on things like Confucius Institutes and classrooms, on scholarships, as you've said, a whole range of things like that. India simply can't compete on that level. And what it's tried to do instead is it's tried to focus much more on, as you said before, targeted aid in some places, like in Afghanistan, for example, helping to build a parliament building there, in training electoral officials to be able to conduct elections and so on. So it's kind of practical governance support. It has offered some scholarships as well to students in the region. And of course, it's hosting the SARC University, South Asian University in Delhi, which brings together students from across the region. But it simply doesn't have the resources to be able to match the sheer number of scholarships that the Chinese are able to offer. And so you've just got I wouldn't even want to put I suspect that for every dollar that India spends, the Chinese are spending certainly 10 and probably something like 20 times more. So their pockets are just much deeper. Now again, whether that's having the kinds of effects that we might expect, whether they're getting results for that expenditure is I think a bit questionable actually.
So sir, when we talk about this thing that China has a deeper pocket and India doesn't. So do you think that if India, what is the way out for India? Means not about competing, but still being into the game. Because if we compare the deep pocket, then and if we employ that strategy, it's not, forget about fair competition, it's not in the competition also. So what do you think that India's way out should be, especially in soft power diplomacy in this region, to be in the game at least?
So I think we do need to recognize here, though, if we look at the results for perceptions of China across the whole Indo-Pacific, not just in South Asia, what we find is that public opinion about China has deteriorated over the last few years. So we need to recognize from the start that China's investment in soft power has not necessarily paid off. And in some cases, it looks as though it's in a worse position now, despite the money that it spent, than it was a few years ago. And that's because what it does in other areas, whether it's pushing on the border with India or on the South China Sea, or some of the aggressive things that it's done with some of its recently, those things tend to undercut the public relations effort, if you like. So recognizing all of that, what could a country like India do? I think it can carry on doing some of the things it's done quite well. So some of the things about governance support, about democracy support, helping countries organize elections, something that's actually quite difficult, but India has a long track record in doing this. Those kinds of things have worked very well. They're not very expensive, and they can be expanded to a degree, and they would have a tangible kind of benefit. I think too, India's kind of soft power works best where its hard power is not seen and not felt. And I think in some places, and Nepal is actually a classic example of this. Modi, at the beginning of his time in office, made a big push to try to charm Kathmandu, to try to charm Nepal broadly. But then, of course, in 2015, we saw the blockade happen, and that really turned public opinion against India. Now, that could have been managed better, and that would have allowed some of the soft power messages to have worked their way through potentially the elite and the public in Nepal in a way that I think they was stopped from doing because of the blockade and all the negative publicity that came out of that. So it needs to do some of the things it's already doing. Of course, it needs to invest, I think, in some of the things that it knows is successful. And it needs to recognize as well that India has this vast reservoir of civilizational and cultural products, if you like, that are actually very attractive. So things like Bollywood movies, classic and new. These things have huge appeal across the region, and they are very attractive, and they reflect extremely well on India.
So, sir, you're talking about China's aggressive policy. Like we are like India and China are having a border clash for more than a month, and the recent killing of Indian soldiers from the Chinese side. So, this aggressive position taken by China vis-a-vis India and in South China Sea, do you think that this has actually made China's image of peaceful rise go for a toss in this region? And do you think that this gives a window of opportunity for India to increase its influence among the small countries of South Asia?
I think so. I think India it's going to have to tread carefully, and it's going to have to be intelligent about that. But there's no doubt that China's image has been hit not just by some of the things that it's done on the border, which is actually very shocking to audiences outside of India and outside of China. People in Australia that I've talked to, in Southeast Asia, are very shocked by what's gone on. And really quite horrified at the Chinese actions. But prior to that, the coronavirus, the COVID-19, that has really turned public opinion against China. It's made public opinion much more skeptical about what the Chinese are saying, because there's been obviously, there's obviously a gap between what has gone on and what the Chinese have said about it. You see these hashtags on social media about China lying and so on, circulating very, very widely. So my personal view is that China's reputation has sunk quite considerably. And in fact, I think that there may even be a linkage between its more belligerent and aggressive behavior and public perceptions out there in the world, that as public opinion sours about China, and as things like the Belt and Road Initiative start to stall a little bit, you're seeing insecurity in Beijing, and that's manifesting itself in some of this assertion that we're seeing on its borders.
So, sir, when you like you have said that China's handling of post-COVID, basically the COVID situation, the coronavirus situation, which it has handled. So, so do you think this COVID, the handling of COVID by China, has dented China's image in South Asia, or through Mark's diplomacy and through medical aid, has it turned it into this adversity into an opportunity, especially when we talk about Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan? So
I don't want to be evasive, but I think to some degree it's a bit too soon to tell exactly how the medical diplomacy is going to play out. I'm not convinced that it's going to have the kind of effect that Beijing perhaps thinks it does. After all, it's really just helping to solve the problem that it arguably created, or that the public perception is that it created it. I think certainly when you look at India, Indian public opinion has turned quite dramatically against China. I think Nepal is a different case because of its troubles with India mean that it's turned more towards China, and public opinion has turned. Pakistan, again, is a very particular case. And obviously tensions between India and Pakistan tend to play out. And again, Bangladesh, so on and so forth, I think there are different dynamics in play. I just don't think that there's going to be a clear relationship between China's investment in some of this medical support around coronavirus and the kind of the sinking public perceptions of China. And the other thing here, I think, is that we're really only halfway through this pandemic now. It has got a long way to run, and I think if you're looking at if in a really unfortunate situation that hundreds of thousands of Indians die, which I think is possible, that will also happen in Pakistan and Bangladesh too, because of just the nature of those societies. And so we really need to be looking at this a year from now or 2 years from now, when hopefully this pandemic is over.
So, sir, pandemic, border clashes, China's aggressive behavior, and all those things. Do you think that now India will be a more preferable brand than the China among the people of South Asia?
I think so. Look, in some places, I think the relationship with Pakistan is so damaged right now that it's very hard, and there's almost no people-to-people contact, between the two sides. One of the things about the pandemic that has been positive is that sometimes when I've done webinars or Zoom meetings and so on, people from Pakistan and people from India have joined, and they've actually been talking to each other, which is very difficult to do in other contexts. But that said, the relationship there is very bad on a public level as well as on a political level. Again, Nepal, I think, for very particular reasons, again, is problematic. But elsewhere in the region, provided if India is able to help in some way in some of these regional countries, if India is also able to show the way in managing the pandemic in a strong way, then I think that it could be advantageous for India. And certainly, India will simply gain because as China's reputation sinks. And right now, there's no sign that China's reputation is going to improve dramatically, even with the medical aid and everything else that's been going on.
So since China's image has taken a hit, and that's for sure, and you have said this in the interview also right now, it's taken a hit. So do you think that to manage it or to make up for the losses, will we see a more deep pocket, more investment, more aid, more money being pumped in from China in South Asia?
Look, there are signs that the amount of money that China has available for these kinds of projects is dropping or it's flatlining. So when we're looking at some of the recent figures on Belt and Road investment, right the way across the whole Belt and Road, we've seen that it's actually dropped in the past 2 years. Now, it may be that China prioritizes that money and decides that it doesn't want to spend it in places like the South Pacific, for example, and it wants to move that to places where it thinks it might have a greater advantage, and that might include Central Asia and parts of South Asia. It may be that it will do that, and that might mean that the amount of money flowing. But I think we have to bear in mind that China right now has been hit very hard by the pandemic. There has been a downturn in China itself, and that means the amount of capital that China has to invest at home and abroad has taken a big hit. I think that's, so we shouldn't underestimate the economic trouble that China itself is in. And I think that's going to mean that China's going to have to prioritize. And, there's always been domestic opposition within China to Belt and Road. Because there are many people in China, remember there are many people in China who are still sitting below the poverty line in rural areas. There are many people in China who argue that China should have a better pension system, have a better healthcare system, and so on. There's many people in China who would like to see that money spent at home and not abroad. And those voices are not going to go away, even if they can be damped down by the regime. So I'm not sure that there are obvious ways out of this problem for China.
So, answer, when we talk about Indian toolkit of soft power, it has been, as you talked about, cultural connection, Gandhi, Bollywood, and all these things is very much prevalent. So, in the post-COVID order, should India use these tools only, or does India soft power diplomacy in South Asia needs a revamp and it needs to change in some ways?
Look, I think, again, the resources that it has available for across the range of foreign policy are limited. So if I was going to prioritize where the money would be spent, I would spend that money on recruiting more diplomats than it has. Its diplomatic service is far too small. It just is far too stretched. It needs to spend money there. But that said, it does have this vast pool of resources that it can use. I think too, though, that personally I'd like to see India go back to some of the earlier concepts in which it wanted to be an example of governance in the region. So where India's management of an incredibly diverse, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society was an example to others. And its democracy was an example to others. So it didn't try to push or export democracy or anything like that to anybody else, but it simply was a model. And I think it needs to be a model too in terms of economic development, to show the way to high rates of economic growth, to lifting people out of poverty, that is different from the authoritarian model that China has been offering. So I think there's an awful lot to be gained there for India as well, where it doesn't need to spend money on more diplomacy, but it does need to spend money, it does need to spend effort and energy on making sure that governance works in India and that is fair and is equitable and everything else, and making sure that development really, it keeps going and that you see those high rates of economic growth. Those are the things that are going to improve India's image in the medium to long term.
So, sir, we have talked about how China's image has been dented by its recent action and COVID. Do you think that India's image has also been dented in the region, especially when we see CA and NRC being protested in Bangladesh, and this issue with Nepal, and people are very vehement about this border issue. So do you think that India's image has also been dented in the South Asia in recent times? Do you think that?
Oh yes, I don't think there's any doubt that some of the things that have been done, and some of these are foreign policy choices. So I talked a little bit earlier on about the blockade in 2015 and some of the issues with the map now in Nepal. That is unquestionably, and I think unnecessarily, made that relationship much more difficult. I think too, some of the management of internal issues, whether it's Jammu and Kashmir, whether it's the riots in Delhi, those kinds of things, that they don't just affect the image of India in the West. They also affect the image of India in other parts of the world, whether it's in South Asia or Southeast Asia and so on. In Japan, for example, the riots and some of the civil strife that went on at the end of 2019 was one of the reasons why Abe Shinzo, the Japanese prime minister, decided to cancel his trip. And so, the other issue was the regional comprehensive economic partnership, which India pulled out of. But I think we need to recognize here that some of the things that happen within India do damage the relationships with other South Asian states and then much more broadly across the world.
So, sir, like everything is now moving online. Like now we are talking on Zoom and a lot of webinar is happening, online classes and everything is happening. So do you think that now web diplomacy will gain more importance? And who do you think between these two countries will be better placed, or is right now better placed to do web diplomacy in South Asia?
I think so. Look, we're only a few days past the first virtual summit between the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Narendra Modi. And that was a fairly big event, and it was well publicized, and it seemed to work fairly well. And we seem to be using, diplomats are using web-based platforms. We're seeing a lot more ambassadors. Our new ambassador, Barry O'Farrell in India, is using video messages to try and communicate with the public in India. And I think a more take-up of that kind of thing by Indian diplomats who, traditionally they've been quite conservative about how they communicate with their counterparts, but also how they communicate with foreign publics. I think Jaishankar, the foreign minister, has shown the way in this. He's been much more open, talking in public settings about Indian diplomacy than pretty much any minister has done in the past. And I think that's a very positive move. But moving beyond that, these platforms are going to be, I think, hugely useful for Indian universities, research institutes, think tanks like yours, a whole number of institutions to connect to other bits of the world that perhaps, it's been difficult to do because they've lacked the resources to fly people in or to host visitors and so on. And one of the things that's been really positive about the last couple of months is that I've had more interactions with with scholars in India, with seminars and students and a whole range of others than I have done in the before this pandemic. So it's a kind of whole of society effort, I think, here that Indians can work on to reconnect with a lot of the region and then a broader world outside that.
And so what about China, like China's web diplomacy? How do you see that China's web diplomacy is going to shape up in the post-COVID world order, especially in this region?
That's much more difficult because a lot of the platforms that China uses are open to people from outside of China, but some of them are now being boycotted in India and so on. And because a lot of the platforms that Indians use, or the people in South Asia more broadly use, are not the same platforms as China uses. So of course it's hard when we're using Twitter or Facebook and yet they're using WeChat or Weibo, these kinds of platforms. There's already a block there between China and the rest of the world and South Asia straight away. I think things like TikTok for a while were they were a way of kind of connecting. A lot of people in South Asia seem to take up that technology. But we also know that, of course, that the Chinese authorities have been censoring messages that have been posted on TikTok and so on. And I think that's affected perceptions of that technology in South Asia, as it has, again, elsewhere in the world. The other problem we've got to recognize here is that it's not easy online to communicate with Chinese audiences without the state intervening in some way. So let me give you an example. I was on a webinar recently that discussed Australia-China relations, which have been quite difficult recently. There was a guy in China, in a Chinese university, who was on the call, but there were no other China-based people on the Zoom call out of 100 and something or other. And when we asked him why this was, he said, I don't know, maybe they just didn't sign up or they didn't come in or whatever. But it became quite obvious that the authorities just simply wouldn't allow that to happen. So we need to deal with the fact that any kind of interaction that we have with the Chinese at almost every level is monitored by the state and treated with suspicion.
So this democracy and the openness which India has and Indian state provides. So you mean to say that this, in terms of web diplomacy in South Asia, India is better placed, and because this is a more open society, India is better placed to carry out web diplomacy in South Asia and in connecting with people than China is. Am I right, sir?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I think that it's clearly the case that India is better positioned. I mean, I'd like it. It'd be good to see, again, not governmental thing, but again, the think tanks, universities, and businesses and everyone else using, taking this opportunity now to use this technology to connect in. It's a great opportunity to talk to colleagues in Pakistan or Bangladesh or Nepal and to try to talk through some of these issues. So absolutely, India is much better positioned than China is.
So, sir, we're moving forward with this. Should India build a pan-South Asia or a pan-BIMSTEC e-network like it has built in Africa and link all universities and hospitals in this region to facilitate teaching and medical consultation, because India has an edge over it? And can you think that this can be a game changer for India's image in this region?
Look, it certainly could. And as you say, it's pioneered those kinds of technologies, those kinds of linkages in parts of Africa, for example. So rolling it out elsewhere would be potentially, that could be potentially quite useful. I think certainly in places like, some of the Indian Ocean states, for example, that might be quite useful, quite positive. I think in places like Nepal, Bhutan, potentially, again, I think, there could be some real advantages to be had there. The tricky bit has been doing anything on a SARC basis has always ended up in kind of Pakistan-India arguments. As you said, you could use BIMSTEC or one of those other platforms in order to do that, one of the other institutions. But certainly, I think there's all kinds of opportunities that could be exploited there.
So, sir, this is my last question to you. So this is that, what is the one USP of India's soft power diplomacy and one of China's soft power diplomacy, which will be their biggest advantage in post-COVID world in South Asia?
Well, that's a really good question, and I'm not completely sure how to answer it, to be honest with you. I think that let me give you the answer that I think you would get from the two capitals. My sense is that Beijing is betting that it can argue that its governance model has dealt with the pandemic better than anybody else's, and therefore it should be adopted in some way by other states in the region. I'm not convinced that would work. I'm not convinced that is true, and I'm really not convinced that that will be positive for the region. In India's case, I think it's a little bit different. I do think that India can serve as that alternative model, but it has got to go through this crisis and at the same time succeed in economic and governance reforms that allow India to deliver, to deliver what it's promised to this. So that kind of inclusive development messages that Mr. Modi was talking about at the beginning of his government, those things need to be realized. And if they're realized, then India really can be a much better model for the countries of the region than China will be. So I think those are the things that they will kind of, will unlock things. I'm not sure that, more marketing around particular Bollywood movies or particular texts or particular, new posters or another kind of shining India shining kind of campaign. I'm not convinced that all of those things actually have much of an effect. In the end, what people look to is whether these countries have been successful and whether they're governed in a reasonable, open, transparent, accountable way.
So, thank you, sir. It was a very insightful interview, talking to you about all these things about India, China, and their soft power diplomacy and how they are going to deal with it within their domestic borders and across it. So it was very nice talking to you, sir. Thank you for joining. And I'm thanking you on the behalf of AIDA also that you gave us the time from your busy schedule. So it was a very nice and insightful interaction, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.